the Earth system is always creating something better or the same value. So, for example, recycle system, let's take a car. A car is designed, it has plastic in. That plastic then gets used, when the car is dead, it gets used for a bench. Then that plastic from a bench will get used for a toothbrush. The toothbrush will turn into a toothpick, and then it goes to landfill. So that's downcycling. What we want to be doing is upcycling. So let's take hops, waste beer, let's take waste coffee, and let's take agricultural waste, and we can then use that agricultural hops and coffee, and we can upcycle that into organic mushrooms. Because you can take waste streams and you can through a biological process, you can turn that into something more valuable. Well, that's what the biosphere has been doing since 3.4 billion years.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neil Collins, and on this show today we have designer and serial entrepreneur Dr. Vincent Walsh of Regen Farm Co., Microloops, and Herbalism. Vincent talks about overcoming adversity and developing business systems for circular design. If you've been tuning into the show, you know that I love to get into people's backstories. You see, I picked up on patterns that over the course of this podcast project, it seems like the most interesting people are the ones that chart a vocational path that combines their own unique story and experiences with what they believe the world needs. And that takes a lot of courage. Today's guest is a great example of this. Dr. Vincent Walsh grew up with a learning disability that could have had lasting implications for the rest of his life. Left up to the prevailing educational culture that we have, Vincent could have been labeled a problem child or a lost cause. We know this because thousands of kids each year fall through the cracks in our antiquated system, and their potential is never cultivated or nourished. Fortunately for Vincent, he was able to find art as his initial entry point for a lifetime of discovery, adventure, passion, and entrepreneurship. I was amazed at his story from intentionally living on the streets in the US to experience homelessness, raising funds to create a closed-loop agriculture-based store operation in a derelict building in the UK, and creating mutually supportive businesses that ultimately help to regenerate farmland. As always, thank you for support of this show. It is truly a labor of love, and it would mean the world to me if you enjoyed today's episode to share this podcast with your friends or colleagues. Tag me on Instagram or LinkedIn. You can find us at latitude.regenerative.re and share what brings you to the emergent field of regenerative real estate. Hey everybody, welcome back to another podcast episode of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. I am very excited because we have a guest coming in from across the Atlantic, Dr. Vincent Walsh. Vincent, it is a pleasure to have you on. I got to tell you, I'm really looking forward to our conversation because it looks like you have your fingers in a lot of different cookie jars. Why don't you tell us where you're tuning in from first before we get into it?
So lovely to be here. Been looking forward to doing this with you. I'm calling in from Little Britain, and I'm based in Manchester. But I do travel here, there, and everywhere with my work. But if anybody asks me where home is, it's definitely Manchester.
In Manchester. Well, Vincent, you had made a comment on something I think I posted on LinkedIn, and I looked at your bio, and it was talking about regenerative agriculture and a circular mushroom company and a plant-based food company. But underlying it all it was really design forward. And I just thought, there's got to be a story here. And I think the best way to pick up a story is to really go back to where did you grow up and what were you doing really from an early childhood? Were you thinking in terms of agriculture and food production, or what did childhood look like for you?
Yeah, no, actually, I wasn't kind of through my childhood thinking about food. I guess what really defines me, you could say, from being very young, I'm dyslexic. So I'm one of them very fortunate people who have double dyslexia. So about 2% of people in the UK have double dyslexia, and it's the most chronic dyslexia. And also I have Erline syndrome, which a lot of people with chronic dyslexia tend to have. And also I've got a little bit of dyspraxia. And I'm telling you that because actually most people who have dyslexia are system thinkers. So we don't think in linear ways. That's probably why we find it very hard at school, because everything in school is linear, where actually our brains are actually more system-based. We look at wholes and we see connections between long distances. And actually that's very good for intelligence gathering, and research and so on. So I have to be very honest, school was not a nice place for me. I really struggled. And by the time, you come out at 15, 16, I think most of my confidence was actually taken out of me. But I guess what I was very good at is talking and getting people motivated. And I'm always interested in newness. Right from very young, I always wanted to be doing new things, testing things, failing a lot, I guess, and learning through process rather than sitting at school looking at a book. It just wasn't the way I learned. I learned by being out of the school and doing things, climbing trees and getting into trouble and just learning through doing rather than kind of learning through school. So, and obviously you don't realize this when you're at school, you just think you're a bit of a troublemaker and you're no good. And so, yeah, in school, it was difficult. I enjoyed, my time outside of school a lot more. Probably say as well, I'm one of four. My mother, Phyllis, brought all of us up on single-handedly. When a mother is trying to bring four children up as well as she can't concentrate on just one of them. And therefore, as a boy, the first boy, I've got two older sisters. I think I probably got away with murder more than my sisters because I was a boy and I could kind of go out and stay out later as a kind of a young lad, just out there, more of a street lad doing things and trying to learn as you go along.
That's really interesting about dyslexia. At what point did you build that confidence back up?
Oh, it was very late. I mean, honestly, I didn't go back to proper education until I was 23. Like I said, you come out of school and you don't really understand yourself. All you've been told is you're thick, you're the clown of the class, and therefore you act on that, don't you? You become that. You become that person that people tell you are because you're not very, academic. I simply just could not sit down in school. I could not sit down for an hour. I'm just a really active person. So when did I realize? Oh, very late on, very, very late on. So when I tried getting to college, because I didn't have no education, basically all my exams, I got U's on all the, I don't know how it is in the States, but U is basically the worst grade you could get, and I have to do a foundation because I didn't have any GCSEs or anything. So you do the foundation course. Remember at this time I was kind of 20 and I was in the class with kind of 17-year-olds. So I was older, but I was still, probably less academic than most of them 17-year-olds. So this was, when I say foundation course, I mean very, very basic courses. It was like how do you sign a check and write a check, and this was a kind of the business foundation course, very, very basic. But actually, I started seeing a girl at the university, and she was actually doing arts, and she was upstairs on the second floor. So I started going to see her, and I was like, actually, this suits me a little bit better. Actually, there seem to be more cooler guys in there, just like doing painting and sculptures and so on. So from there, I ended up doing a photography course, a very basic photography course at the at Stockport College. And even though it was very basic, the guys who were running it were actually very well known in the music industry. So they used to do music video for the Dubs. Rick Myers, he was called. So even though he was a lecturer at the university in photography, he was also a very well-known guy in Manchester scene. You know, we've got a great music scene in Manchester, as I'm sure you know. And, you know, Rick Myers was doing a lot of the photography and videos. So I was really lucky that I ended up on this course, just a basic college it's about 10 miles outside of Manchester. And it was at that point, doing that photography course, I guess it was the first time in my education where I realized I can actually do something. You know, I'm not as bad as I was told in school, you know, and I'm quite creative and so on. And that was really the real first time that I guess the penny kind of dropped. But still at that time, I didn't know I was dyslexic, because you're doing an art course, a photography course. So it's all about the format and the media, you know, and making, you know, exciting and pretty things with narratives. And therefore you're leaning on your experience more than your academic knowledge. So even at that time, I knew there was kind of something wrong, but my dyslexia didn't get highlighted even then. From the photography course, after that, I completed it. I got a distinction, and then I got an opportunity to go to Westminster University to do photography, a really good university. I'm telling you this for a reason, because it's quite funny. So they see my creative work, said, we want to see Vincent, get Vincent to come down. So I went down for an interview. You go there in front of the teachers and doctors and so on. And I presented my work, and they loved it. And just before I was going, one of the receptionists come out and said, Vincent, you haven't done your 500 words. I can't remember what the 500 words was supposed to be on, but it was 500 words. Anyway, I was in the position that I was in the university. I was going to join them. I think it was the following September. It was all kind of signed and sealed from that, having that meeting around my creative portfolio and so on. But then I tried to write this 500 words. And I did there and then, and I give it to them, and then I went home. And that was on a Friday. And when I come in on the Monday morning, my tutor brought me in, and they've taken the offer away because they basically couldn't understand what I'd written.
Oh, wow.
So it was at that point where I think I realized there was something chronically bad around my writing. And then I started to think about, okay, right, I need to kind of get this looked at. But actually, that year, I walked away from photography and probably didn't think I was going to go back into it, because I was quite upset, you know, to be honest. But actually, the next year, I applied to another university to do moving image design. And I was really upfront with them at the interview stage about my issues around writing and so on. And they said, let's see your creative work first, and let's see if we can get you in for a psychology assessment. And that's what they did. So it was at that point, going into my moving image design, the first year, I realized that, I had dyslexia, Erline syndrome, and dyspraxia, and it was all these things together that makes it very difficult to read. Just so you know, the Erline syndrome is a visual deception. So it's when you're reading and the page animates, the text animates very slightly, and words like and, it, in, also bold, and my eyes kind of flick across the page to them words. So it's really difficult to learn how to read when you've got them, and then you start realizing what the struggle was with school.
Well, how incredible that the second school actually understood and had the capability to see beyond a 500-word essay that you'd have to present, to actually be able to give you the help that you need and put you on the track that you needed to go down. So you pursued a creative design focused undergraduate degree. And so where from here?
Yeah, good question. So I think from very early on, I think what defines my work then and what defines my work now is design. So I've always been a designer from, that moving image to course design. It was all designing title sequences, the videos, and it was also one of the best places to go. I was really lucky to get to Ravensbourne Institute of Design and Communication. It was literally the best place to go for moving image design. And a lot of us in our second year and third year were already working in Soho, at weekends and evenings and so on, because they had really good links. So yeah, through that design course, that moving image design course, I really got an understanding of what design is, and how to build narratives and how to build stories and how to galvanize people through them stories and narratives and so on. And interestingly, my delivery of that course after the 4 years, I made a documentary in the US. So I decided I wanted to go to 3 cities that I've never been to. I wanted to understand what it was like to be in 3 places to try feed yourself, because there's always been a narrative of food around my work. Why? I have no idea. So yeah, at the end of this course, my delivery of that exhibition was a 10-minute documentary called Angels in Poverty. So I left Manchester with $75, got into JFK with $75, got into central Manhattan with $30 left. And then that was it. I had a video camera, had prepaid ticket. And then I just videoed myself, living rough in New York for about 3 weeks. And then a plane from New York over to San Francisco. San Francisco, I went to Tenderloin. It's quite interesting, San Fran, because you get a lot of people going to San Fran, and not because it's warm in the summer, but also, as I understand, it's one of the only states where you can kind of sign on for a 6-week period and you can get some money. So I came across a guy who, when I got into San Francisco, he'd been in the penitentiary, we will call it prison, for 14 years. So he was in prison from when I was around 16 years old or something like that. And he was telling me that why he came to San Francisco, because he would sign on for a 6-week period and get a little bit of money. And also there's 6 missionaries in the Tenderloin. So you can get, basically I was learning all the tricks of the trade of where you get your food from, how you take juice and put juice in your, these plastic bags, and you put a knot in it so you can drink it later. All the tricks of the trades of the homeless. And then from San Francisco, I flew over to Chicago and then went over to South Chicago. The police took me off the street about 2 days of being there. Why? Because supposedly I was in an area of gangs, and someone had rang the police and said there's a guy walking around with a video camera and he really should not be in this area. So interesting, the police came and picked me up. They brought me to the police station that night. And then, as you will know, there's a thing called a ride-along, which you can do with the police. It's something you can't do in the UK. I don't know if it's every state, but in Chicago, you can request it. So they let me drive around for one day in the car with the police, and they would spot all the homeless. Because why did they do that? Because, as you know, in San Francisco, all the homeless are central, where in Chicago, they don't like all the homeless hanging around in the city. So they try to push them out. So what the police ended up doing is dropping me off with a guy called Jimmy Profit, who had been giving out sandwiches, condoms, boxer shorts, toothpaste, food, everything. They would collect, him and his wife would collect lots of free materials, and then they would go and give that to a homeless. And all the homeless people in Chicago knew Jimmy Profit. He's an ex-Vietnam guy, really hard guy, walked around with a massive knife on him and a massive stick. I spent 3 or 4 days with Jimmy and his wife. I don't know if you know, but in South Chicago, there's people living under the old railways. There's families who live under there. And he brought me there. We used to walk 10, 15 minutes into pitch black. Yeah, I just couldn't believe it. And families were living in underground areas. He brought me to a building once, which was 3 stories. Each floor was around 8,000 square foot. And in each floor, you had around 150 people, and all the rooms were separated by chicken wire. It was unbelievable. But you had everybody in there, from ex-Vietnam guys, crackheads, 16-year-olds, homeless people, travelers, hobos. It was just a mix of kind of left side people, I guess. But yeah, that's what I delivered for the final piece. So right early on, actually, in my thinking, food was always a key driver. But that definitely didn't come from my mother. But I don't know why I ended up kind of thinking around food, and I still haven't really worked it out. But yeah, that's kind of what I did for my BA honours.
I am just blown away by that story. I don't think many people, even living in those cities, get the opportunity to have an experience that raw and intimate. And not a lot of people that I've ever come across are flying to a different country with $75 in their pocket and looking to have that kind of experience. Man,
it was it was no holiday, my friend.
Do you think that experience has really stayed with you in order to really shift your perspective on the current work that you're doing? Or how do you think that shows up in your life?
Yeah, so I think it definitely showed up later on in my PhD. I think it was a great life experience, and just understanding how hard life can be, and how important it is, evidently, to have good access to good food and so on. But I guess another bit of my travels, which kind of really took me into looking at going away from creative design in terms of film and title sequence and so on, was my time in Africa. So I spent time in Ethiopia and Nigeria. So I was in Ethiopia looking at agroforestry systems, which are regenerative food systems. And I did this kind of around my master's work. So I went from a BA honours in moving image design. Then I went from there and I worked in Soho, which is like the creative centre in London. A lot of all the big agencies like Frame Store are all in Soho. But then I just didn't like it. And I also think, going back to my childhood between 14 and 18, I was getting up to a lot of things I shouldn't be doing. And in Soho, I was realising actually there was a lot of kids that didn't have all that background, and they were experimenting at that age, where I had already done it. I wasn't really interested in, alcohol and drugs and so on at that stage in my life, even though, I've done a bit of it before. So, I've been in Soho. It's a great creative place, but it's also, a bit of a party place. So from there, I kind of moved, and I decided to do a master's in architecture and urbanism, but we were focused on agroforestry. So I was interested in how do you create complex agricultural or complex food systems in urban environments. Why don't we do that more? And started to kind of think about, what kind of food systems could we design in urban environments. And that was everything from agroforestry to forest garden to hydroponics, aeroponics, vermoponics, the full, plateau of systems. Why are we not doing that in cities? Again, it was a master's, so you can think quite broadly. You've only got a year. Let's do something interesting. So for that year, I hardly spent any time in the university. I probably spent about 4 weeks in university that year. So basically what I did was very, very near Manchester, there's a place called Hume. I found a garden that someone wasn't using. It was quite large. And I went and knocked on the door and said, look, I'm doing a master's around the corner. I want to understand, can we design a regenerative agricultural system in an urban garden? Can I take over your garden for a year and see what we can do? And that's what I did for that year. I virtually spent a year in that garden, buying trees, buying shrubs, buying plants, trying to stack the layers, looking at the forest layers. So in the UK, we have 7 layers in a forest. So that's the canopy, larger fruit trees, smaller fruit trees, shrubs, plants, soil layers, and then your cover crops it, and so on. So I took over that garden. I just started to try put these different elements of our ecosystem into that garden and see if it could work. And that's what I did for the whole year. And then I wrote basically, a dissertation on what that was like, going through that process and the learning. We call that action-led research in the UK. So instead of sitting at a university, writing 20,000 words about how you think something should be, my work has always been about go out in the real world, do something, and then write about what you learned. And I guess that documentary in America was, why I ended up saying it was an observation and interpretation of what was happening is because, again, I didn't want to say what was happening. That's what researchers do in universities. What I wanted to go and see what was actually happening, record it, experience it, and then write about that experience. And the master's was no different. It was just spending a year in a garden thinking about how do you turn this into an ecosystem. And then, I started then extrapolating that. Okay, what happens if we could get 40 gardens all doing that? Can we create a complex ecosystem with 40 gardens and so on? And then from there, I had an opportunity to go to Africa to do agroforestry, Nigeria. Travelled out of Nigeria to Port Harcourt and River State, and I was with organisations like the World Agroforestry Research Trust, and I was basically just again looking at what they were doing and learning lots, having a lot of fun, but also kind of really keeping an eye on how they design and. Them tropical systems them tropical agroforestry systems. I didn't realise there were agroforestry systems at the beginning. I was very kind of new to it, but now I can look back and, so an agroforestry system is basically layers. So at the top you could have coconuts. Underneath that you might have coffee. Underneath that you might have yams. And then you have some soil, potatoes or a groundnut or something like that. That's how complex ecosystems evolve. They build layers of complexity, and that's why pioneering species are really important and so on. And fungi is important. Hydrology is important. Actually fungi is probably the most important now. Fungi is way older in the biosphere, than plants. No fungi, no forest, no woods. We're deeply connected to mushrooms and fungi, So, it was kind of in my master's kind of learning all that. But by the time I come out of master's, my tutors were like, do you want to do a PhD? And I was like, if they think I can do a PhD, yeah, I'm going to go for it. Because it would have never come into my mind. Honestly, my friend, it just wouldn't, because how bad my literature is and so on. But they put the idea in my mind. Because they asked the question, and I was thinking, well, if they're asking me, they think I can do it, I must stay to do it. So that's how I ended up on my PhD.
What an incredible journey. And what strikes me about this, Vincent, is that you went into an architecture program, but was thinking about agroforestry. What year did you go through that?
Yeah, what must have been about 10 years ago. Yeah.
Okay, so 2012, around there?
Yeah, exactly. And it's a good question. Why agroforestry and why cities? Well, what is a city? Firstly, it's an extension of our mind. That's really what a city is. It's a technology. And interestingly, we think that, we were the first to do that. When you think it's just an extension of our mind, it's a technology that we've created to provide us shelter, provide us, a culture, provide us food, etc. Well, actually, that's no different from what a beehive provides for bees. It's no different to what a termite mound provides for termites. It's no different than a nest, what a nest is for birds in a way. So I think that kind of thinking was interesting, for me, thinking about what nature did from a structural perspective, why have we built cities? And and we're the only species who out of the 20 other million species in the biosphere. Why is it just us? And actually, when you look, it isn't just us, and evidently it isn't, because we're an extension of the biosphere. It's them 20 million species from 3.8 billion years ago, which has enabled humans to evolve, 250,000 years ago. So there was that element of thinking about cities as a natural, as an ecosystem, but also what is a city in terms of structure? Well, it's a three-dimensional structure, and what are agroforestry systems? A three-dimensional structure. So why do we see a lack of really complex ecosystems in cities? Why don't we build ecosystems in the same way that we build complex architecture? So I was just thinking about these things, and also very much kind of, I was very much into people like Kevin Kelly, who wrote Out of Control, which is about neobiology, and he speaks a lot about the Biosphere-2 project, which is a project in Arizona, which I actually wanted to go, but I never ended up getting there. And he was speaking about biospheres and closed ecological life support systems, and how cities need to become like life support systems. And therefore, there's a huge kind of biological element that needs to be integrated into cities to make them highly sustainable, adaptive, ecological. The kind of cities that put carbon in the soil, raise the biodiversity, produces, highly ecological food. A completely twist on, the kind of cities that we've built. And even architects like Paulo Soleros, who wrote The Urban Ideal, these are kind of architects and system designers, who I was really interested in. And then there's the whole kind of element of, system design. The 1940s, they were basically looking at computer systems, and they were asking themselves, well, how do we create a network? Remember, this was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, so before the internet. And these guys, these system thinkers, had a number of conferences called the Mesa conferences. And these were, the radicals. And they were thinking about, how do you develop networks and so on. And where were they looking? They looked at fungi. And why did they look at fungi? Because they realized that fungi is the best peer-to-peer system that we've ever had. In a forest system, fungi connects everything together. What the fungi does is slowly but surely connects all them trees together, so it can feed the nutrients. So what it basically is an information highway. That's what fungi is. So when you look at the actual structure of fungi underneath the soil, what we call the mycelia, and you look at the internet web, the internet, the World Wide Web, and that structure, they're a mimic of each other. And they're a mimic of each other because that's where our thinking came from, peer-to-peer systems. So these are all the things I was kind of thinking, when you ask that question, why were you thinking of agroforestry in cities? Well, it was bringing all that stuff together, and it goes back to system thinking. There's the CIA and the GCHQ. I think it was in 2016. They both collaborated and they created dyslexic labs. And they did that because they realized that people with chronic dyslexia can make long-distance connections between information. And that's actually brilliant for intelligence gathering. So I think, when I was doing that master's, I was kind of trying to think about all these things, and how all these things connect or don't connect.
Yeah, this brings up in my mind the Japanese study whenever they overlaid the map of their subway system and put out pieces of wheat, I believe it was. And so first the fungi went out and it sourced the food, but then it completely kind of rerouted and they were able to determine the best path for the subway system in Tokyo. And I just thought that was phenomenal, wow. that deeper intelligence that comes out from the fungi. And so from here, Vincent, I'm curious how you ground this systems thinking with agroforestry and architecture and urban planning. Like, what an incredible nexus to find yourself in. How does this show up in work post academia?
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think firstly, what are cities? They are, they are biospheric, aren't they? Where does glass come from? It comes from sand. Where does brick come from? It comes from clay. So process is really important, because actually all we've done to create cities is use resources, heat, beat and treat resources, create structures out of them. I always see cities as very biospheric, even though, you could say that there is a lack of nature in cities. And I agree with that. I think it's very easy to walk around a city and say there's not enough trees, there's not enough green space and so on. But I think people forget that the buildings are, also ecology. Them raw materials come from the biosphere. So that's just, I guess that's just a side note. But I guess, yeah, taking all that, I think what I did with my PhD brought all that together. I think so. What I did for my PhD was, again, a bit of an interesting story. Again, kind of similar to, it's interesting because I come into the PhD, someone I guess who may be a little bit left field, to other architects. I definitely found that when I did my architecture and urbanism, I realised then how much knowledge I had about ecology, and biosystems and so on, and it was only when I was in that, going through that master's, I realised that actually landscape architects and urbanists and architects as a whole, I thought, have a real lack of understanding of biological systems, which was a shock to me. But I didn't know that until I went through that course. And I think that's why they asked at the end of the course, they were saying, if you wanted to do a PhD at any time, we would let you do a PhD. So I ended up going back to them and said, okay, I'll do a PhD. And they were like, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to take over a building, a 3-story building, and I want to start building biological systems in it. I want to build a biosystem. And then from there, they really kind of pushed back on it then. And they said, look, you can't, for a PhD, you've got 3 years, you can't do that. It's not possible, basically. And then they also said to me, look, we might not able to fund you fully for the PhD. I'm telling you this for a reason. So I kind of looked at this and I thought, no, what I want to do is important and it is possible. And they were talking about how do you even get a building, a warehouse? How do you go and do that? At the time I wasn't even thinking about the money that needs to be raised and all that kind of stuff. I just said, this stuff's important. Anyway, so I went and seen a property developer called Urban Splash. They were probably the best developers in Manchester and still are one of the best developers. And their CEO is called Tom Bloxham, a really good entrepreneur. He built a company up. He's very like me. You could say I'm more like, I'm a little bit like him. I wouldn't say I'm as successful as him in any way, but what I'm saying there is he started as a poster guy, selling posters in Manchester, and now he owns one of the biggest property developers in Manchester and probably one of the best. So he's very entrepreneurial. He's got his hands in lots of pies, etc., etc. So I went and seen him and said, look, this is what I want to do for a PhD. I want to get a building. I want to build biological systems in it. Have you got anything? Anyway, he offered me a building. He gave me a building called Irwell House. So Irwell House was 6,000 square foot each floor. It was on the edge of Salford and Manchester. And I signed it over for peppercorn rent. So then I went back to him. I went back to the university and I went, there's your building. I've got a building now. So I want to go and I'm going to get a PhD. But also, and then I started raising capital. Within 6 months of taking over the building, I raised just over £850,000 to get the project going. And then as I started doing the work, people started to hear about him. And then I got approached by a festival. They wanted to get involved. And then I also applied for £90,000 from the People's Postcode Lottery. And he ended up getting that. And very, very quickly, within about 8 months, I had the building. £850,000. Then the university completely changed the tune. Then they were like, oh no, you can have a full PhD. We'll pay you fully for your PhD and so on. So very quickly, that the tide started to turn. It all came into process. From 2014 to 2017, really, is when I delivered that project. So what I did was, so firstly, the building was in. So this goes back to kind of what I was doing in America around poverty and so on. So this building, it was in an area deprivation. So that was really good. And we also mapped the area very quickly. And it was basically a food desert. That the people in Salford had to come to Manchester, another city, to get any decent food. It was really poor. And in that area, it had like some of the worst crime, some of the worst cancer, alcoholism, etc. Salford and Blackfriars is getting better. It's much better than it was. But for the local people, the people 3-4 generations, being in living in that area deprivation, life was not too good, and especially their diets were not too good. So what I did, thinking about poverty, thinking about closed ecological life support systems, thinking about biosystems, thinking about architecture, all this come together. So basically what I did was, right next to the building, I set up a shop. The shop was called 78 Steps. It was called 78 Steps because it was 78 steps away from where we grew the food. It was a whole food store. But next to the building, there was also a piece of land. So we also set up an agroforestry system there. So we had a 3-story building, virtually derelict, and we had a roof, and we also had a piece of ground outside. Basically what we did was, over time we changed it. So we had the shop created the green and the brown waste. The green and the brown waste would then go to a vermiculture system. The vermiculture system was a system outside in the agroforestry area. Vermiculture is worms. So you can feed green and brown waste to worms, and worms will give you worms. They'll give you worm tea and worm castings. Worm castings and worm tea can be used for the agroforestry system as a fertilizer. So we ended up putting around 200 fruiting trees, larger trees, shrubs, all based on kind of permaculture methodology. It had hugel mounds in there. We did a lot of fungi infrastructure. So a beautiful ecosystem out there, which is still going today. And then from the worms, the liquid and the worm casting would feed the agroforestry system. But then the worms we could feed to fish. So what we did in the second story of the building, we set up an aquaponic system. So an aquaponic system is basically a way of feeding fish, and the shit from the fish feeds the plants. So we feed the fish worms and other food. We had 14 tanks. Each tank was 1,000 litres of water, and we had about 400 to 600 fish in each tank, and they were creating all the waste and was pumped upstairs. And upstairs we had a large polytunnel where we grew about 3,000 crops in the polytunnel, and then we take them crops, and crops would go back into the shop. And then that's the kind of whole circular system. So that's what I did for my PhD.
That's unbelievable. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So the third story, you're growing what kind of crops?
Oh yeah, so they were kind of salad crops, leeks. We tried lots of different stuff. And we ended up getting Belfast University in. Siemens came in. Siemens funded it £125,000 because they wanted some of their interns to work on the project. Siemens gave us a whole loads of equipment. It just got mad. I mean, it literally got mad. Just people just got from an idea, and at first the university saying no, and then within 6 months they were like yes, we want to be part of this. So even with Siemens, we ended up designing a facade. So a biological facade, which would have sat on the side of the building, but we couldn't get it through planning. So because we wanted to take the part of the building out and put this bio facade in. So they won't let us do it. So we ended up putting the bio facade in the building. It was, I lived, at the time, what I decided to do was move into the building, So first I was sleeping on sandbags with lots of covers and a sleeping bag and so on. So when I moved into building, we have to spend £50,000 on taking all the asbestos out. I mean, like there was huge amounts of work, about £40,000 in structural engineering. Oh, it was mad, my friend.
What happened to the project in the building after your 3-year period?
Yeah, well, it wasn't. It was a 5-year period. But yeah, the building's obviously still there now. After my PhD, I didn't want to be, living in the building all my life, and I wanted to do other things and so on. So slowly but surely, we kind of, collapsed a lot of the things we did. We give the resources to local food companies and so on. The agroforestry system is still there because there's probably 10, 20 artists in that building now. So they've changed the inside of the building quite radically, but the outside of the building, the agroforestry system is still there. And many times I still walk around there on Sunday mornings just to check the trees and just spend some time in there. And it's great. We've got everything from, I would say still to this day, it's probably the most complex ecosystem, food system in and around Manchester, without doubt. Because there's probably, 60 different trees in there, probably 30 different shrubs, lots of fungi infrastructure we put in, so the agroforestry system is still there. 78 Steps, the shop, we slowly closed that down as well. Again, it's a PhD, and to be honest, I did get a bit of backlash for that because I went in as a PhD, but when you raise a lot of money, I have to they wouldn't put that money in my personal bank account for obvious reasons. So I have to create a business, and then everything starts getting a bit serious and so on. But, I was there for 5 years to do a PhD, and I did my PhD. Actually, I went off to Spain for a year to kind of chill out after that 5 years.
And do you think that it would be economical? I mean, could the building support itself with the operations that you put in place?
No, to be honest, probably not. I made a lot of mistakes. Look, who in the right mind on a second floor of a building puts 12,000 litres of water up there? I mean, the way we were able to put the tanks of water on the building was basically on the beams. That's how we did it. So we mapped the beams across the floor, and we put the 1,000-litre tanks across the beams. So that was the only way we could actually, if we didn't leave the tanks on the beams, basically leaning on the actual structure of the building, we put it in the middle, the building would have collapsed. So yeah, they had, and even they have to come in on the ground floor and put scaffolding up, to make sure that the building wouldn't collapse. So it was an immense project, and 5 years. I mean, it took a lot out of me, but it was a great PhD.
That sounds like a wild story. That is incredible. Before we get back into the episode, I want to share something incredibly exciting with you. For the first time ever, there's going to be a regenerative real estate gathering at the end of the summer at the one and only Riverbend Farm in Saco, Maine. Now, I'd call it a conference, but that would definitely be doing it injustice, as the gathering at the world-famous Riverbend Farm will be like no other conference you have attended. This place may sound familiar to you if you tuned into the episode I did with Drew Dumpsch in June of 2021. You see, Drew is the founder and the executive director of the Ecology School, which is housed at the bucolic 105-acre working Riverbend Farm. Not only will we enjoy the company of incredible visionaries and professionals, but the environment itself will blow you away. You see, the farm was designed as one of the world's first Living Community Challenge projects that is put out by the International Living Future Institute. This rigorous building certification goes beyond the Living Building Challenge and is the perfect setting to not just talk about how we can transform the real estate industry, but what it looks like, tastes like, and feels like in real life. So join us August 24th through the 27th and get to know the people behind this regenerative movement. These are the professionals that are part of the transformation of the way we inhabit this planet. They are designers and developers, consultants and lenders, and the ones that are shaping the future of how we design, build, transact, and steward land and place. During this time, you'll learn firsthand about the world's most innovative real estate projects, such as living buildings and living communities. You'll be able to swap strategies and get insights about funding sources that are looking to spur regenerative real estate projects. You'll be able to connect with regenerative practitioners that are revolutionizing the real estate industry by demonstrating that real estate can be used as a force for good. This is the time that we need leaders and co-creators like yourself, now more than ever. This is not an event that you're going to want to miss, and it'll be such a small investment that has truly a lifetime of value. You can learn more by visiting Latitude's journal at chooselatitude.com/journal to search for the event. I hope to see you there. Vincent, let's talk about what you're doing now. So you've got a couple different companies that you're involved with. Do you want to go into some of that work?
Yeah, so I own 3 companies. I'm a nightmare for my accountant, literally a nightmare. He hates me. He actually hates me. But he's not saying that when he's taking money off me, but he does hate me. And these, again, this goes back to system thinking, my friend. So I've got a company. Look, how do you create sustainable, adaptive, ecological food systems? Well, it's all about regenerative and circular infrastructure, and where do we get it from? Where do we get regenerative design from? Where do we get circular systems from? It was 3.4 billion years ago. Yeah. So it took the biosphere virtually 4 billion years. The biosphere or our Earth system emerged about 3.8 billion years ago. But it was 3.4 billion years when our system started to become circular. And how did it start to become circular? Through photosynthesis. So, it was through that process, through photosynthesis, that our Earth system started to become circular. Because we know that the biosphere is energetically open and materially closed. So what does that mean? Well, the energetically open bit is about the sun. Yeah, so it's called energetically open because we know the sun isn't within our Earth system. It's outside of the Earth system. So that's why we call it energetically open. The materially closed bit is what happens when the sun comes in. Photosynthesis creates sugars and starch. Them sugars and starch gets turned into fiber, plants, trees, shrubs. And then as they live and grow, the materially closed bit is the bit what happens in the soil and happens in oceans and so on. And that's why we call it materially closed, because that happens within our biosphere. So all systems, we don't know any closed systems. There can't be any closed systems because all systems are reliant on the sun. So that's why we call it energetically open and materially closed. So closed ecological life support systems, that's what the biosphere is. The biosphere is a region of this system where all life resides. Like, we are biospheric. The 20 million species and us all live within the biosphere. And why am I saying that? I'm telling you that because if we want to create a continuous, regenerative, hyper-ecological, sustainable, resilient system, it has to be circular. And what is circular? Circular is not recycling. Circular systems are upcycle systems. So the Earth system is always creating something better or the same value. So, for example, recycle system, let's take a car. A car is designed, it has plastic in. That plastic then gets used, when the car is dead, it gets used for a bench. Then that plastic from a bench will get used for a toothbrush. The toothbrush will turn into a toothpick, and then it goes to landfill, for example. So that's downcycling. That's where we don't want to be downcycling, and we do not want to be recycling. What we want to be doing is upcycling. So every time we create something, we design it in a way that it can be used for the same value, or it creates more value. And that's what the biosphere has been doing from 3.4 billion years. So in our terms, what upcycling might look like in the food industry, let's take hops, waste beer, let's take waste coffee, and let's take agricultural waste, and we can then use that agricultural hops and coffee, and we can upcycle that into organic mushrooms. Because you can take waste streams and you can through a biological process, you can turn that into something more valuable. Well, that's what the biosphere has been doing since 3.4 billion years. So when we talk about circular and regenerative infrastructure, what we're talking about is biological systems. What we're talking about is the biosphere, that how the biosphere creates complexity through its circular regenerative. So my three businesses. So the first business is called Regen Farm Co. And what Regen Farm Co is, it's a farming company which take over land with farmers, and slowly but surely we turn that farmland back into regenerative systems. And we do that in silver pasture and silver arable. So we can develop complex systems with animals. And if some farmers don't want that, we can also create complex systems without them. But understand this, that animals and insects have always been an integral part to ecosystems. The idea that we shouldn't have animals, I'm thinking about veganism now and plant-based and so on. Animals should always be part of our ecosystems. Why? Because they've evolved that way. There's a reason that we have lower insects, we have invertebrates, more complex animals, birds, bees. They're all a needed part of an ecosystem. So Regen Farm Co. is taking over farmland. And how do I fund that? What's the business model? I work with food companies. So food companies right now are thinking to themselves, how do we hyper-localize our production? How do we stop relying on global food markets and create something more hyper-local? That's what Regen Farm Co. is doing. We're just about to start work on a 560 hectare farm in Scotland. And the idea is by the end of this year, in our portfolio, we'll have no less than 200 hectares of land. And in the next 5 years, we'll have 1,000 hectares of land that we are focused on and working with. So that's what Regen Farm Co. does. Then there's herbalism. So herbalism is a plant-based food brand. We have 6 products in that range, and most of that is based on mushrooms. So we have a chorizo sausage, a 10-inch chorizo sausage based on mushrooms. We have a herb burger. We have a mushroom burger. We have a veg and mushroom sausage variety, etc. And where are we selling these? We're selling these into large venues, like stadiums. So we've done like the O2 in London. We provided actually 13,000 units for COP26. We're putting stuff into different football stadiums, etc. So we're trying to help them stadiums develop a product range which is UK based and more sustainable than importing Beyond or Impossible Burger from you guys in the States. I think that hyperlocalizes them to hit sustainability is really important. So that's what herbalism is doing. And then I have a company called Microloops. And Microloops is probably the newest out of the three of them. And what Microloops is doing, it's a biological manufacturing company. So we take waste streams, we take agricultural waste, we take coffee waste, and we take hops from beer companies. And the idea is that we're setting up a large facility to take them waste streams and upcycle them waste streams. So you basically take your waste streams, you put them into a certain bag, into a structure, and you can then inoculate that waste stream with the mushroom. And then you put it in a warm room. And what that thinks is, the mushroom then thinks, all right, I'm in a tropical, nice environment, and what I need to do now is grow the mycelia. And that's the stuff, when a mushroom grows out of a forest, the mycelia is the bit that we don't see under the soil. So what happens is that the mycelia of the mushroom eats all the substrate, eats all the coffee. And then what you do after about 7 to 10 days, you put it in a very cold room, and then the mushrooms then think it's winter and we need to spore. And that's when you get the fruiting body and you produce mushrooms out of it.
Wow. I'm almost speechless just to think about running each one of those different organizations. And I'm curious, how do you lead three separate companies like that? And this is more of a personal intrigue, because it sounds like they're quite distinct from each other.
Yeah, but they're not. I understand what you're saying, but actually they're highly connected. So how does herbalism get the most sustainable ecological products? It gets it from Regen Farm Co. So we want to create highly sustainable crop. Regen Farm Co. is looking at what are the new crops in the UK. The UK is a cold climate. We're based on perennials rather than annuals. We're not a warm climate. So what I'm trying to do with Regen Farm Co., and this is why it's separate, because it's a farming company to look at what are the future crops that we should be growing in the UK. But then growing the crop is one thing, but then I need a market to grow that crop. That's where herbalism comes in. So I've got the structure ready. So as we test new products like Good King Henry, which is our native spinach, instead of using spinach from the south of Spain, we're starting to grow that crop and test that crop. And when we find something that absolutely works, we've already got herbalism set up, already selling products into the market. So we can then quickly use Regen Farm Go products. We send that to herbalism manufacturer, and then herbalism can start producing then crops that come out of Regen Farm Co. But also we create waste through that process. And also I'm working with companies who produce a lot of waste. And that's where Microloops comes in, because herbalism is based on mushrooms. All the products have some kind of mushroom in it. So I was like, well, I want to create all my own mushrooms. So why don't I start working with the food companies that I'm working with, start taking all their waste streams, instead of letting that go into landfill, why don't I start to take that waste resource and start upcycling it into mushrooms, and then I can feed that back into herbalism. So thinking about that, that circular, regenerative, but also system thinking approach, it just makes absolute sense to me to have the three companies.
What is the value proposition that you think you deliver with the Regen Farm Co.? If a farmer's got land, what do you provide there to really captivate their attention, to want to sign up for you to help regenerate or revitalize?
It's a really good question. I think that the basic one for that, my friend, is, I think, what is the difference between a farmer and what I do? Well, I build ecosystems. So what I'm really interested in is the elements and the layers and the ecosystem as a whole. How do you emerge that? Because why would you want to emerge that? Well, we know complex systems tend to self-regulate. They tend to be more sustainable. They tend to get to an equilibrium where they can continue to survive, where a farmer doesn't think in that way. If a farmer just stops farming, that the farm would go to, well, actually, it'll turn into an ecosystem over many. If you stop farming a farmland over many years, it'll turn into an ecosystem. But what I do is think about, how do we design that ecosystem? And right now in the UK, most of the farmers are about to lose their money. So I don't know how it is in the US, but all farmers in the UK are supported by subsidies. So they get money basically for not using their farm properly. For many years they've been in a way signing on that every year they get a form from the government. They say how much land they've got. They say how much sheep they've got, and how much money they haven't made, and then basically the government subsidizes them to do what they do. It's madness, But in the UK, that finishes in I think around 3 years. So, and the money is already getting reduced. So farmers now in the UK are now looking for all new opportunities. But that's happening right at the same time that food companies are also looking at that, because the food companies in the UK realise that to hit their net zero targets, they cannot continuously air freight product into the UK. But our farmland has gone into decline over the last 100 years because of globalised markets. So we're in a situation now where we're saying, well, there's a huge opportunity. What I'm doing is just connecting the dots. I'm just bringing them two together. So, for example, I'll give you an example. There's how I started the first project. There's a water company called Yorkshire Water, and they're the largest landowner in the UK. Now, I know just because of the climate that they were looking at ways of creating more sustainable land-based systems, because they understand they're a water company. Whatever happens on your land will go into your water. Yeah, land and water is deeply connected. So they were looking for how to create better landscapes. And at the same time, I was freelancing for food companies that were saying to me, Vincent, we need to start looking at more sustainable food crops. How do we do that? So what I did was I went to Yorkshire Water and said to them, look, give me some land. Let me speak to some of your farmers, and I will show you that I can create a better economic system for them. And they're saying, well, how do you do that? Well, I need to speak to the farmer first. So we ended up working with one farmer, Derek Greenwood, 80 years old, lived in that farmhouse all his life. He's only been out of Yorkshire once to Wales. He's never had a passport. That's very traditional of farmers in the UK. They just farm their land. So I spoke to him, and he was like, yes, I'm really interested in this. Let's do something different. And I said, why don't you come along on this journey with me? We'll set up a new company, Regen Farm Co. And what you can do is you start donating money to Regen Farm Co. And then what I will do is start working with farmers to develop better ecosystems, to produce food, put carbon in soil, and raise the biodiversity.
Oh, man. What a phenomenal just way to create partnerships with people that desperately need it as well. And understanding who has assets and really being able to see that full picture. Vincent, I am just so thrilled that we had this opportunity to connect. How would people go about really tracking the progress of what you're doing with these 3 different companies?
Well, I think probably the best way to catch up with me is LinkedIn. I'll do a lot on LinkedIn. I'm actually really poor on other social networks. I'm not a TikTok guy. I'm not a Twitter guy, Instagram guy, or anything like that. But if anybody kind of wants to get in contact with me, I'm always up for doing new stuff.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we're going to have to get you to the US and put your skills to the test here, because we sorely need it as well. But I think it's sorely needed everywhere. And I think the alchemy that you've created with how you're able to take a design approach towards systems. And I don't see a lot of people with this architecture and urbanism background that's also bringing in food systems and really making that link between the urban and the rural. And that's what I get so fired up about is seeing these examples come to life. And so I get a lot of inspiration from hearing this story and really appreciate you taking the time to come on with us.
No, it's been really nice and a great opportunity for me as well. So, thank you very much for the opportunity, and make sure we stay in contact, at least on LinkedIn. And if you ever want to invite me back to the States, you only have to ask me once.
Hey, and we'll put you up, and you're not going to have to sleep under a bridge, or and you're not going to have to go homeless whenever you come back. Hey, thanks for tuning in to the show today. If you want to follow our work at Latitude, you can follow us on Instagram at latitude.regenerative.re, and mine is at I am Neil Collins. We inherently believe in the potential that comes from connecting value-aligned and purpose-driven people together in community. That's why I encourage you to join our mighty network and introduce yourself to the other people working across the globe to advance a more regenerative, resilient, and beautiful world. Here, we want to know what you're working on and what inspires you. Through this platform, you can attend live events, take courses provided by our podcast guests, and create connection with other people and businesses that share your same passion. To join, find the link in our show notes or visit our website at chooselatitude.com. If you'd like to support the show, please share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on your podcast app so that you always have the latest episode downloaded. Another way to support our regenerative field building is to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Positive ratings help attract amazing guests, and they can be the deciding factor for someone else to tune in and listen. And who knows, maybe this is the kind of motivation that it takes for them to finally decide to align their profession with their sustainable and regenerative values and become a positive force for good within their own community. This show was produced by myself and edited by Anthony Wallace and offered as a part of our work with Latitude Regenerative Real Estate.